Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another legal breaking reporting and video analysis update. Today, for the evening, for the afternoon, we have two legal breaking reportings for you guys this afternoon, November 1st, 2025. Our first reporting is by CNN. Orwell, current and former prosecutors. Orwell, current and former prosecutors alarmed after the DOJ scrubs mentions of Trump and January 6th prosecutors from court records. Let's get into the reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be going through this as fast as we can to get through the to get to the next reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, the article is titled Orwellian. Current and former prosecutors alarmed after DOJ scrubs mentions of Trump and January 6th from court records, which, ladies and gentlemen, per the Constitution is not allowed. But knowing who leads the DOJ, Pam Bondi, fuck you, by the way, you stupid cunt, you stupid bitch. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the article reads: the Justice Department's decision to sideline two U.S. attorneys and remove mention of Donald Trump, and the U.S. Capitol attack from court papers before the sentencing of a pardoned January 6 rioter is being viewed by former and current career prosecutors as an alarming whitewashing of history. The events around the case of Taylor Taranto, who was convicted of bringing illegal guns near Barack Obama's Washington, D.C. residence after talking online about violence toward the federal government, has shocked the network of Justice Department employees and alumni. Several sources told CNN Taranto was arrested in June 2023 after claiming on an internet live stream that he had a detonator the day before. Law enforcement officials told CNN at the time, and was searching for underground tunnels that led inside Obama and others' homes. He had also been present at the Capitol riot and charged with related crimes, though he was never convicted because Trump pardoned him before a trial. He has already spent 23 months behind bars and hasn't been detained since he was pardoned. Judge Carl Nichols, a 2019 Trump appointee, had found him guilty at trial in May of the gun crimes and for making a false threat to use a car bomb against a federal building. In a sentencing memo for Taranto filed Tuesday, prosecutors Carlos Valdivia, that's Valdivia, ladies and gentlemen, in case the last name pops up misspelled differently in the reporting video transcripts, and Samuel White wrote that after then former President Donald Trump published on a social media platform the purported address of former President Barack Obama, Taranto reposted had reposted Trump, and thereafter started live streaming from his van as he drove through Obama's neighborhood. Trump's original post, which included the Obama address, was itself a repost of a blog article. Ladies and gentlemen, this order from Judge Carl Nichols, the Trump appointee. Toronto's actions caused the evacuation of a residential neighborhood and forced law enforcement agents from multiple agencies to respond to his false bomb hoax. The government recommends that the court sentence Taranto to 27 months of incarceration total for the offenses he committed. A 27-month sentence reflects the gravity of Taranto's conduct, his lack of remorse, and the need to deter him and others from engaging in similar threatening conduct. On January 6, 2021, thousands of people comprising a mob of rioters attacked the U.S. Capitol while a joint session of Congress met to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election. Taranto was accused of participating in the riot in Washington, D.C. by entering the U.S. Capitol building. After the riot, Taranto returned to his home in the state of Washington, where he promoted conspiracy theories about the events of January 6, 2021. In June 2023, Taranto returned to Washington, D.C. He drove through the city and the surrounding region in his van and engaged in alarming behavior that targeted public officials. His erratic behavior intensified on June 28, 2023, when he live-streamed himself and suggested that he had outfitted his vehicle with a detonator. He made several statements indicating that he intended to blow up his vehicle at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. He stated that he was headed to NIST and that his van was self-driving. He stated that he was just going one way for this mission to hell. He remarked that the vehicle was capable of driving by itself, and that he would not need to be anywhere near it when it goes off. Taranto said he had been working on a detonator, but he didn't really need one for this. U.S. Capitol Police obtained a copy of his footage and issued a be on the lookout alert to several law enforcement agencies, informing them of Taranto's van and his comments about a detonator. Politico reporter Kyle Cheney highlighted the filing and mentioned it also included Taranto taking part in the January 6th riot on the social media platform X late Tuesday night ladies and gentlemen, within 24 hours, the court filing was no longer available in the court record, and the two prosecutors who had signed it were suspended from their jobs. Completely illegal of what the Justice Department is doing, ladies and gentlemen. Talk about weaponizing the Justice Department. In the original memo, Valdivia, again, that's Valdivia, ladies and gentlemen, in case his last name pops up in the reporting video transcripts misspelled differently. And White wrote that Taranto was accused of participating in the riot in Washington, D.C. by entering the U.S. Capitol building, and after the riot, Taranto returned to his home in the state of Washington, where he promoted conspiracy theories about the events of January 6, 2021. Two new prosecutors then filed an amended version of the sentencing memo to the court on Wednesday. That new memo scrubbed all references to Trump and him posting Obama's supposed address, which Taranto had posted as well as Toronto's participation and conviction related to the January 6, 2021 U.S. Capitol attack. It's shocking that prosecutors could be put on leave for accurately stating the court record in a sentencing memo, and it's just as shocking that those truthful statements have been whitewashed in a revised filing. Stacey Young, who's a former Justice Department attorney, said, and now executive director and founder of Justice Connection, which works to represent, ladies and gentlemen, the viewpoints of former federal prosecutors, especially those who have been fired by the Trump administration. These prosecutors did their job and upheld their duty of candor by informing the court of clearly established facts relevant to their case, Young added. Janine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., did not comment on the suspensions and filing changes when asked about it during a news conference Thursday. This quote from Janine Pirro. I think the papers speak for themselves and what goes on. What goes on in this office, unquote, Pirro said. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the section of the article titled Orwellian. On Wednesday, the moves made by the Justice Department had employees reeling within the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. and the FBI, which had investigated and caught Taranto, believing he was a danger to the public. In 2023, people familiar with the official office told CNN on Thursday. One source called the sentencing memo change Orwellian. Valdivia. Again, ladies and gentlemen, in case the last name comes up as misspelled in the reporting transcripts, it is spelled Valdivia. Ladies and gentlemen, had no indication he may have employment issues, especially given that on Tuesday, the day before his suspension, he helped to secure a guilty verdict from a jury in a fraud case where he was on the trial team, according to two people familiar with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Separately, White is a supervisor on Superior Court cases. And was a U.S. Marine. Ladies and gentlemen, let's turn back to the court filing. Then, former President Donald Trump published on a social media platform, the purported address of former President Barack Obama. Toronto reposted the address on the same platform and thereafter started live streaming from his van on his YouTube channel. Toronto broadcasted footage of himself as he drove through the Kalorama neighborhood in Washington, D.C., claiming he was searching for tunnels he believed would provide him access to the private residence of certain high-profile individuals, including former President Obama. He parked his van, walked away from it, and approached a restricted area protected by the United States Secret Service. He walked through the nearby woods and stated, "Gotta get the shot. Stop at nothing to get the shot." After noticing the presence of the Secret Service, he said, "If I were them, I'd be watching this. Watching my every move." He said, "So yeah, more than likely, these guys also all hang for treason. And I control the block. We've got him surrounded." When Secret Service agents approached him, Toronto fled, but he was apprehended and placed under arrest. Shortly following his arrest, officers located Toronto's van, and multiple law enforcement agencies responded to the scene. Mindful of the possible existence of an explosive device or detonator, members of the Metropolitan Police Department and FBI Special Agent Bomb technicians conducted a safety sweep of the van for hazardous or dangerous materials. A lawful search was conducted. Was then conducted of Toronto's van, which was parked near the scene of his arrest in Kalorama. 2 firearms were seized from the backpack he left in the van. The CZ Scorpion, serial number C193454, and the M&P pistol, serial number LFK6710. The CZ Scorpion had an accessory attached to its frame, marked by SB Tactical as a stabilizing brace. Police also recovered hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Ladies and gentlemen, and the article continues, a Justice Department spokesperson told CNN on Wednesday, following the suspensions, while we don't comment on personal decisions, we want to make very clear that we take violence and threats of violence against law enforcement, current or former government officials extremely seriously. We have and will continue to vigorously pursue justice against those who commit or threaten violence without regard to the political party of the offender or the target. The spokesperson declined to clarify if the comments were about Toronto's 2023 actions towards Obama or his participation in the Capitol riot in 2021, in which a mob of Trump supporters injured multiple people, including many police protecting the federal building. The move by Justice Department officials to place the two attorneys on leave and erase all mention of Trump posting Obama's address or Toronto's participation in the events of January 6th comes of a time when administration officials have already worked to fire scores of federal prosecutors and officers they see as potential roadblocks in their efforts to use the DOJ against political opponents, which, ladies and gentlemen, I will add is illegal. Ladies and gentlemen, this will eventually come back to bite these guys in the rear. Prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia were recently pushed out of the Justice Department after failing to indict New York Attorney General Letitia James, and many prosecutors who worked on January 6 cases were removed from the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office earlier this year. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the portion of the article with the headline titled, Toronto Sentenced to 21 Months. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, that portion of the article reads, When Taranto was initially investigated, one source said he had been on federal law enforcement radar because he had been at the January 6th riot, but federal authorities focused on him after he livestreamed a video in 2023 where he threatened bombing federal facilities, and law enforcement then arrested him near Obama's Washington address. Taranto was arrested that day, and law enforcement officials found guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition in his van. He was later found guilty by Nichols of several gun-related charges and making false threats that he would drive a car bomb into a federal building. The DOJ continued to seek 27 months. To seek the 27-month sentence originally sought by White and Valdivia. Ladies and gentlemen, again, Valdivia, in case the name comes up as misspelled in the reporting video transcripts, is Valdivia, who said in court documents that Taranto has also made threats against former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and Maryland Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin. Toronto's attorneys asked the court to sentence him to time served in jail already with no further detention. The decision, defense attorney Carmen Hernandez has asked for rehabilitation that the court could order, noting Taranto's past military service and post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, according to a filing on Thursday. Typically, a defendant's history and characteristics become part of court arguments for or against leniency when a judge decides a sentence. At a hearing Thursday, Nichols sentenced Taranto to 27 months in prison, essentially covered by time served. Nichols found that Taranto made troubling statements in his online livestream, but noted he had no criminal history and his conduct was far from egregious. Taranto spoke briefly during Thursday's hearing, not to apologize for his conduct, but to highlight a book on the 1787 Constitutional Convention, and mention that some people questioned the results of the 2020 election. Ladies and gentlemen, this quote from Taranto: "I would like to keep people's minds open," he concluded. The judge also said he thought the two prosecutors placed on leave upheld the highest standard throughout the case. Ladies and gentlemen, this view from Judge Nichols. This quote from Judge Nichols. "My view is that they did a commendable and exceptional job." Nichols said of prosecutors, adding that he felt they did a truly excellent job in this case. White and Valdivia, again, ladies and gentlemen, in case the name comes up as misspelled in the video transcripts of the reporting, is spelled Valdivia, ladies and gentlemen, attended Toronto sentencing and declined to comment. Ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, we have our second legal breaking reporting for the afternoon, titled Supreme Court Prepares to Confront Monumental Case Over Trump Executive Power and Tariff Authority. Ladies and gentlemen, the article reads, Economic imperative or executive overreach? That is the question the Supreme Court is preparing this week to confront in one of its most monumental appeals over the scope of executive power, a time-sensitive challenge to President Donald Trump's expansive import tariffs over most countries. The justices will hear oral arguments Wednesday over lawsuits from a coalition of small businesses and several Democratic-led states who say Trump has abused his authority by declaring a national emergency to impose levies on nearly every country in the world. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I will add that Canada and Brazil, those tariffs are wiped away completely because the Senate recently voted to overturn both of those countries on the tariffs that Donald Trump illegally imposed. Which is a sharp rebuke and rebuttal of Donald Trump and his administration and the illegal agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, and the article continues, at issue is whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, gives the president that power. Lower federal courts have ruled against the executive branch, but Trump's Justice Department warns denial of tariff authority would expose our nation to trade retaliation without effective defenses. The financial and political stakes are enormous, with potential immediate effects on the domestic and global economies. Businesses and industries, large and small, are nervously watching how the court will act. The Supreme Court will decide whether or not Congress, in fact, gave the president the fairly broad authority that he's claimed to impose tariffs on, in a way that no president has used it before. Thomas Dupree said, who is a leading appellate attorney and a former top Justice Department official. Not to say that's necessarily impermissible, but it is something that the Supreme Court has not seen in recent years, and is going to weigh in on whether whether or not he's overstepped the authority that he has under the law. The consolidated expedited appeals will be the first major test on the merits of the White House's aggressive second-term agenda to remake large swaths of the federal government and the outsized role this president has so far played. The administration has been winning most of the emergency appeals at the Supreme Court since January, dealt only with whether challenged policies could go into effect temporarily while the issues play out in the lower courts, including immigration, federal spending cuts, workforce reductions, and transgenders in the military. In doing so, the 6-3 conservative majority has reversed about 24 preliminary nationwide injunctions imposed by lower federal courts, leading to frustration and confusion among many judges. Now those persolocating petitions are starting to reach the Supreme Court for final review, and legal analysts say the bench may be poised to grant broad unilateral powers to the president. The justices fast-tracked the administration's appeal over a high court ruling on the merits could come quickly, perhaps within weeks. Both sides have urged a quick decision since the U.S. has been engaged in active, ongoing trade negotiations with dozens of countries over the past months. This could be the start of several high-profile merits appeals over Trump's executive actions. In December, the justices will decide whether to overturn a 90-year precedent. That's precedent, in case the word comes up misspelled in the reporting video transcripts, ladies and gentlemen, dealing with the president's ability to fire members of some federal regulatory agencies like the Federal Trade Commission. And in January, the power of President Trump to remove Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors will be tested in another major constitutional showdown. For now, the Biden-appointed Cook will remain on the job. Other appeals that could be added to the High Court argument docket include birthright citizenship and other immigration-related petitions, diversity, equity, and inclusion, policies in educational institutions, and the environment. Congress is given the power under the Constitution, the Constitution's Article 1 to lay the collect taxes, and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and, and excises. But when Trump in February began issuing a series of executive orders, he relied on the IEEPA, which gives the president the power under a self-declared national economic emergency to investigate block during the pendency of an investigation, regulate, direct, and compel, nullify, void, or prevent or prohibit any acquisition, holding, withholding, use, transfer, withdrawal, transportation, importation, or exportation of, or dealing in, or exercising any right, power, or privilege with respect to, or transactions involving any property in which any foreign country or a national thereof has any interest. The Trump Justice Department says the choices are stark. President Trump and his advisors have determined that erroneously invalidating the IEEPA tariffs would have catastrophic consequences for our national security, foreign policy, and economy. So, U.S. Solicitor General D. John Sauer, who will argue the case before the justices, citing Trump's own words, wrote, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to do it for this legal breaking reporting and video analysis update, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize that this did take a little over 45 minutes to go through these two major reportings, ladies and gentlemen. If you did enjoy this reporting, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and enjoy for more, and follow along for more legal breaking news that you need to know about. More to come soon.